My aunt demands I pay off her debt because I wouldn't be successful without the family. The envelope was thick, the kind lawyers use for official documents, and my Aunt Veronica handed it to me across the table at the coffee shop like she was doing me a favor. Inside was an itemized invoice on actual letterhead she'd had printed, listing 17 years of family investment in my development, with dates, descriptions, and dollar amounts next to each entry. Birthday gifts, $4,200. Christmas presents, $3,800. Graduation money, $1,500. The list went on for 3 pages. Every gift and gesture she claimed the family had given me since I was 8 years old, tallied with interest, calculated at 8% annually. The total at the bottom, highlighted in yellow, was $86,340. She sipped her latte and said this was the amount I owed the family for making me who I am today, and she expected payment within 90 days because her credit card debt had gotten out of control and I was clearly doing well enough to help. I stared at the invoice, at the professionally formatted columns and the precise calculations, and felt something cold settle in my stomach because this wasn't a joke or an emotional outburst. This was planned, calculated, and completely insane. I'd been working as a software engineer in Seattle for 3 years since graduating from college, building a career at a mid-sized tech company that paid well and offered good benefits. I lived in a decent apartment in Capitol Hill, drove a reliable Toyota, and had finally paid off my student loans 6 months earlier. My life was stable and normal in ways it had never been growing up. I'd worked for everything I had, putting myself through community college first to save money, then transferring to University of Washington for my final 2 years. I'd worked full-time through most of college, writing code for freelance clients and doing IT support on campus to pay tuition and rent. I'd graduated with $32,000 in student loans, a decent GPA, and a job offer from my current company. I'd spent the 3 years since graduation living frugally, paying down debt, and building savings. The success I'd achieved was mine, earned through late nights and sacrifice, and the kind of determination that came from knowing nobody was going to rescue me if I failed. My family situation had always been complicated. My parents divorced when I was 6, and my mother struggled with addiction issues that made her unreliable at best. I bounced between her apartment and my father's house depending on which parent was more stable at any given moment. My father remarried when I was 9 to a woman named Patricia, who had 2 kids of her own, and suddenly, I was the odd one out in a blended family that never quite blended. My Aunt Veronica was my father's older sister, a woman who'd never married or had children and who saw herself as the family matriarch. She hosted holiday dinners, organized birthday parties, and made sure everyone stayed connected. She worked as an office manager at a dental practice and lived in the same house she'd inherited from my grandparents. She was the person who remembered everyone's birthdays and sent cards with checks for $20 inside. She seemed generous and caring, and I'd always thought of her as one of the more stable adults in my chaotic family. Looking at the invoice she'd handed me, I realized I'd misunderstood everything about Veronica's generosity. This wasn't kindness or family love. This was an investment she'd been tracking all along, waiting for the moment when I was successful enough to collect on what she considered a debt. I asked her if she was serious. She nodded and said completely serious, that the family had supported me through difficult years, and now that I was doing well, it was time to pay them back. I pointed out that these were gifts, given freely without any expectation of repayment. She leaned forward and said, "That's not how family works. That family helps family with the understanding that help flows both ways." She said I wouldn't have made it through college without the family's support, wouldn't have had the stability to focus on school, wouldn't have become successful without the foundation they provided. I asked her what support she meant specifically. She listed the birthday money, the occasional dinners at her house, the Christmas gifts, the time she let me stay at her place for a week when I was 15 and my parents were fighting. I remembered that week differently than she apparently did. I'd asked to stay with Veronica because my mother had relapsed and my father was on his honeymoon with Patricia, and I had nowhere else to go. Veronica had grudgingly agreed, but made it clear I was an inconvenience. She'd given me a list of chores, criticized how I loaded the dishwasher, and complained about how much food teenage boys ate. She'd made me feel like a burden every single day of that week. The support she was now claiming credit for had felt more like obligation and resentment at the time. I pointed this out as gently as I could, and Veronica's expression hardened. She said I was being ungrateful and selfish, that she'd sacrificed her time and money for me when she didn't have to. She said family was supposed to look out for each other, and now that I was successful, I had a responsibility to help family members who were struggling. I asked why she thought I was so successful. She gestured vaguely and said I had a good job and made good money, that everyone in the family knew I was doing well. I asked how she knew what I made. She said she'd asked around, talked to my father, pieced together information. The casual invasion of my privacy made my skin crawl. If you are enjoying this story already, please subscribe to see more stories like this. I told Veronica I wasn't paying the invoice, that gifts weren't loans, and I didn't owe the family anything for being given birthday presents as a child. Her voice got louder, attracting attention from nearby tables. She said I was being selfish and forgetting where I came from. She said she'd helped raise me when my parents couldn't, that she'd been a stable presence in my life, that I owed her gratitude and financial support. I stood up and said this conversation was over, that I loved her, but I wasn't going to be manipulated into paying for gifts I never asked for. She grabbed my wrist as I turned to leave, her grip surprisingly strong. She said if I walked away, I was walking away from the entire family. She said she'd make sure everyone knew how I'd abandoned them in their time of need. I pulled my arm free and left the coffee shop with my hands shaking and my heart pounding. I sat in my car for 20 minutes trying to process what had just happened. The aunt I'd thought I knew, the generous matriarch who held the family together, had just presented me with an invoice for my childhood and threatened to destroy my family relationships if I didn't pay up. I drove back to my apartment in a daze and immediately called my best friend Lucas, who I'd known since community college. Lucas answered on the second ring, and I told him everything about the invoice, Veronica's demands, her threats to turn the family against me. Lucas was quiet for a moment before saying that was one of the most manipulative things he'd ever heard. He asked if I planned to pay. I said absolutely not, that I couldn't even afford to pay that kind of money even if I wanted to, and I definitely didn't want to. Lucas said I should probably talk to a lawyer, that Veronica's behavior sounded like the beginning of something bigger. I thought he was being paranoid, but I also knew Lucas had good instincts about people. He'd grown up in a difficult family situation himself and recognized manipulation when he saw it. I told him I'd think about it and ended the call. I spent the rest of the evening looking at the invoice again, trying to verify the amounts Veronica had listed. Some of them were accurate, like the $50 she'd given me for high school graduation. Others seemed inflated or outright fabricated. She'd listed $1,000 for housing support during difficult times, that I assumed referred to that 1 week I'd stayed with her, which seemed like an absurd amount for 7 days of sleeping on her couch. The next morning, I got a text from my father asking if we could talk. I called him during my lunch break, and he sounded uncomfortable, clearing his throat several times before speaking. He said Veronica had told him about our meeting, and she was very upset that I'd refused to help with her financial situation. I asked what exactly Veronica had told him. He said she'd mentioned that she was struggling with credit card debt and had asked me for help, and I'd refused to even discuss it. I explained about the invoice, about the itemized list of gifts with interest calculated, about the $86,000 total. My father went silent for a long moment. Then he said he didn't know about any invoice, that Veronica had just mentioned needing financial help and being disappointed I wouldn't assist. I asked if he thought I should pay off Veronica's credit card debt. He hesitated before saying family was important, and if I could help, maybe I should consider it. I felt something crack inside my chest. I asked my father if he remembered me working 40 hours a week while taking a full course load in college. He said he remembered I was busy. I asked if he remembered lending me any money for tuition or rent. He said he'd been supporting Patricia's kids, and money was tight. I asked what exactly he thought the family had done to support my success. He got defensive and said Veronica had always been there for me. That family support wasn't just about money. I ended the call feeling worse than before. My father had always been conflict-averse, always chosen the path of least resistance, but I'd hoped he might recognize how absurd Veronica's demands were. Instead, he was already being pulled into her narrative that I was the ungrateful one refusing to help family in need. Over the next week, other family members started reaching out. My cousin Julian called to say he heard I was doing really well and asked if the rumors about me making 6 figures were true. I asked what rumors. He said Veronica had mentioned I was very successful and making excellent money. I told him I made a decent salary but nothing extraordinary, and I'd just finished paying off student loans. Julian said that's not what he'd heard, that Veronica seemed to think I was wealthy. I asked what he actually wanted. Julian admitted Veronica had suggested I might be able to help him with a small business loan he needed. I told him I wasn't a bank and I wasn't lending money to family members. He got quiet and said he'd thought we were closer than that. The guilt trip was obvious and ineffective. I'd seen Julian maybe 5 times in the last 10 years at family gatherings where we'd barely spoken beyond basic pleasantries. We weren't close, and his sudden interest in my finances confirmed what I'd suspected. Veronica was spreading the word that I had money and should be sharing it. My stepmother Patricia called next, her voice dripping with false concern. She said she'd heard I was having conflicts with Veronica and she wanted to make sure I was okay. I thanked her and said I was fine, that it was just a disagreement about financial expectations. Patricia said she understood family could be complicated, and then casually mentioned that her daughter Bethany was starting college next year and student loans were so predatory these days. The implication was clear. She wanted me to offer to help pay Bethany's tuition. I pretended not to understand the hint and ended the call quickly. The family pressure was building exactly as Veronica had threatened, and I realized she was orchestrating all of it. She'd positioned herself as the victim of my selfishness and was rallying other family members to pressure me into compliance. I spent an evening documenting everything, writing down dates and details of each contact, saving text messages and voicemails. Lucas's suggestion about talking to a lawyer kept echoing in my mind. I researched attorneys who handled family financial disputes and found the website for Anne Griffith, a lawyer with 12 years of experience in civil litigation and family law. Her site mentioned experience with financial exploitation and elder abuse cases, which wasn't quite my situation, but seemed close enough. I called her office the next morning and explained the situation to her paralegal. Anne had an opening later that week. Anne's office was in a professional building downtown, clean and organized with law books lining the walls behind her desk. She was probably in her mid-40s with sharp eyes that missed nothing. I walked her through everything from the coffee shop meeting to the invoice to the family pressure campaign. Anne took detailed notes and asked pointed questions about Veronica's exact words and whether she'd made any explicit threats. I showed her the invoice on my phone, and Anne studied it carefully before asking if I'd signed anything or made any promises to pay. I said no, that I'd refused immediately. Anne nodded and said that was good, that I hadn't created any legal obligation. She explained that gifts were legally different from loans, that Veronica couldn't retroactively declare birthday presents to be debts I owed. Even if I'd accepted the money knowing there was an expectation of repayment, which I hadn't, the statute of limitations on collecting debts had long since passed for most of these alleged loans. Anne said the invoice was essentially worthless as a legal document, but it revealed something important about Veronica's mindset and intentions. The level of detail and calculation suggested premeditation, that Veronica had been planning this for a while. Anne asked if I wanted to send Veronica a cease and desist letter making clear I wouldn't be paying and she should stop contacting me about it. I hesitated because a legal letter felt like escalation, but Anne pointed out that Veronica had already escalated by creating the invoice and organizing family pressure. A formal letter would establish clear boundaries. I authorized Anne to send the letter, and she drafted it that afternoon. The letter stated plainly that I had no legal obligation to pay for gifts I'd received as a minor, that I would not be making any payments to Veronica or other family members, and that further harassment about this matter would result in additional legal action. The letter was professional and firm without being cruel. Anne sent it via certified mail so we'd have proof Veronica received it. I felt simultaneously relieved and anxious about taking this step. I was drawing a hard line, but I was also potentially burning bridges with family members who might take Veronica's side. Anne seemed to read my hesitation. She said in her experience, family members who demanded money this aggressively rarely stopped at asking nicely. She said establishing boundaries early was crucial before the situation escalated further. I trusted her judgment and tried to focus on work and normal life while waiting for Veronica's response. The response came faster than I expected. 2 days after the certified letter was delivered, my phone exploded with messages. Veronica had posted on social media about ungrateful family members who forgot their roots. She didn't name me directly, but the post was timed perfectly with the legal letter, and the comments from other family members made it obvious who she meant. People I barely knew were weighing in about how family should always help family, how success meant nothing without loyalty, how younger generations had forgotten the value of family bonds. I screenshot the post and all the comments and sent them to Anne. She replied that this was harassment and defamation, and we should document everything. Then my phone rang with a call from an unknown Seattle number. I answered, and a woman's voice identified herself as Monica Lang from the King County Department of Social Services. My stomach dropped because I had no idea why social services would be calling me. Monica asked if I had a few minutes to discuss a report that had been filed. I said yes, trying to keep my voice steady. Monica explained that someone had filed a report expressing concern about vulnerable adults in my family being financially exploited. The report specifically mentioned my Aunt Veronica being coerced into giving me large sums of money over the years and now being in financial distress because of it. The report claimed I'd manipulated family members into supporting me through college and was now refusing to help when they needed assistance. Monica's tone was professional but skeptical, like she was reading words she didn't entirely believe. I asked who filed the report. Monica said reports could be anonymous, but given the specific details, it seemed to come from someone with inside family knowledge. I realized immediately that Veronica had filed a false report, claiming I was the one exploiting her. The audacity was breathtaking. I explained to Monica that the situation was exactly the opposite, that Veronica was attempting to collect payment for gifts she'd given me as a child, and I'd refused. I mentioned the invoice and the legal letter from my attorney. Monica asked if I could provide documentation. I said absolutely, and asked for her email address. As soon as we hung up, I forwarded Monica everything: the photos of the invoice, copies of the cease and desist letter from Anne, screenshots of Veronica's social media posts, and a timeline I'd written documenting every interaction. I called Anne immediately and told her about the social services report. Anne's voice got hard and focused. She said filing a false report with a government agency was serious, potentially criminal, if it could be proven to be knowingly false. She said we needed to be proactive and thorough in our response, providing Monica with everything she needed to see the truth. Over the next week, Monica investigated by reaching out to other family members. She called my father, who apparently gave a confused account that didn't support Veronica's claims. She called Patricia, who'd said she didn't know anything about financial exploitation, but had heard there were family disagreements. Monica called me back after completing her initial investigation and said she was closing the case with no findings of exploitation. She said the evidence clearly showed Veronica was the one making financial demands, not the other way around. Monica's voice softened slightly, and she said she'd seen cases like this before, family members using government agencies as weapons in personal disputes. She advised me to continue documenting everything and consider whether I needed a restraining order. The false report to social services marked a turning point. Veronica wasn't just asking for money or trying to pressure me through family. She was actively trying to destroy my reputation and potentially create legal problems for me. I met with Anne again and told her I wanted to pursue whatever legal options existed to stop Veronica's harassment. Anne said we could potentially file for a protection order if Veronica's behavior continued to escalate, but we needed more evidence of direct threats or contact after the cease and desist letter. As if on cue, my email inbox pinged with a new message from an address I didn't recognize. The email claimed to be from a lawyer representing Veronica in a civil suit. The lawyer's name was listed as Jeffrey Trent, and the email stated that Veronica was pursuing legal action to recover funds she'd loaned me over the years with the understanding of repayment. The email demanded I contact Jeffrey's office within 10 days to discuss settlement or face a formal lawsuit. I forwarded the email to Anne, and she called me within the hour. She'd looked up Jeffrey Trent and couldn't find any attorney by that name registered with the Washington State Bar Association. She suspected the email was fake, likely sent by Veronica herself to intimidate me. Anne replied to the email requesting Jeffrey's bar number and office address. The response came back with a disconnected phone number and an address that turned out to be a UPS store. Anne reported the fraudulent email to the Bar Association and local authorities as potential identity theft or fraud. If this story keeps your interest, please subscribe to get more stories like this. The fake lawyer email was my breaking point. I'd tried to handle this quietly and reasonably, but Veronica was escalating to illegal tactics. I authorized Anne to file for a protection order and to report Veronica's actions to police. Anne prepared a comprehensive filing documenting the invoice, the harassment campaign, the false social services report, and the fraudulent legal email. She included all the screenshots, emails, text messages, and witness statements I'd collected. The protection order hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks out. During those 3 weeks, Veronica's behavior got increasingly erratic. She started showing up at family events I was invited to, making pointed comments loud enough for everyone to hear about ungrateful people who forgot where they came from. She told my cousin's wife that I'd become cold and materialistic since getting my tech job. She told my grandmother that I'd refused to help family members in crisis. My grandmother called me confused and hurt, asking why I wouldn't help Veronica when she was struggling. I explained the situation as calmly as I could about the invoice, the demands for payment, the false reports. My grandmother went quiet, and then said she didn't want to be involved in conflicts between her children and grandchildren. She asked me to work it out with Veronica directly. I realized Veronica had won that battle. She'd positioned herself as the victim so effectively that even neutral family members didn't want to examine the truth. I started seeing a therapist named Dr. Raymond Cross, who specialized in family trauma and manipulation. His office was near my apartment, convenient and private. Dr. Cross was probably in his 60s with a calm presence that made it easy to talk. I told him everything about Veronica's demands and escalating harassment, about feeling isolated from family members who believed her narrative. Dr. Cross listened carefully and asked whether I'd ever noticed manipulation patterns from Veronica before this incident. I thought back through years of interactions and realized there had always been subtle manipulation, like the way she'd make comments about people who forgot to send thank you notes or family members who didn't visit enough. She'd wielded guilt and obligation like tools, shaping family behavior through strategic expressions of hurt or disappointment. Dr. Cross said what I was describing sounded like financial abuse combined with a smear campaign, tactics used by people who saw relationships as transactional. He said the best thing I could do was maintain firm boundaries and refuse to engage with her manipulation. He also said I should prepare for the possibility that some family relationships might not survive this conflict. That hurt to hear, but I knew he was right. Some people would always believe Veronica's version of events regardless of evidence. The protection order hearing arrived on a Thursday morning at the King County Courthouse. I wore a suit and tried to look calm despite my racing heart. Anne met me outside the courtroom and briefed me on what to expect. The hearing would be brief, just a presentation of evidence and a chance for both sides to speak. Veronica arrived with a woman she introduced as her attorney, though Anne whispered to me that the woman wasn't listed in the Bar Association database either. The judge was a middle-aged woman named Elizabeth Ortiz, who read through our filed documents before the hearing began. Anne presented our evidence systematically: the invoice, the harassment documentation, the false social services report, the fraudulent lawyer email. She played the voicemail messages Veronica had left that I hadn't mentioned yet, messages where Veronica's voice got increasingly angry and threatening. In one, she said I'd regret refusing to help family. In another, she said she'd make sure everyone knew what kind of person I really was. Judge Ortiz listened to everything and then asked Veronica if she wanted to respond. Veronica stood and said she'd only been trying to collect on legitimate loans, that she'd supported me through difficult years and deserved repayment. She pulled out her own folder of documents, more itemized lists of money and support she claimed to have provided. Judge Ortiz asked for specific evidence that any of these transfers had been loans rather than gifts. Veronica couldn't provide any loan agreements or documents showing I'd agreed to repay anything. Judge Ortiz reviewed the evidence for several more minutes before making her ruling. She granted a temporary protection order prohibiting Veronica from contacting me directly or through third parties, from posting about me on social media, and from coming within 500 feet of my home or workplace. The order would remain in effect for 1 year unless modified by the court. Judge Ortiz also noted on the record that she was concerned about the false social services report and suggested the prosecutor's office might want to review that conduct. Veronica's face went red and she started to argue, but the judge cut her off. The hearing was over. Anne and I left the courthouse and she explained that the protection order was a strong outcome, that it established legal consequences if Veronica violated it. I felt a weight lift from my shoulders knowing there was finally an official boundary with teeth behind it. I went back to work that afternoon and tried to focus on my projects, but my mind kept drifting to the courtroom and Veronica's furious expression as the judge ruled against her. I knew this wasn't over, that Veronica wasn't the type to accept defeat quietly. I was right. 3 days after the protection order was granted, I received a letter from the IRS. My hand shook as I opened it, because the IRS was every working person's nightmare. The letter stated that discrepancies had been found in my tax returns for the previous 3 years, and I was being audited. I needed to provide extensive documentation of my income and deductions within 30 days. I immediately called Anne and she said this was suspicious, that audits usually didn't come out of nowhere for straightforward W-2 employees like me. She suggested Veronica might have filed a false report with the IRS, claiming I had unreported income. I contacted my tax preparer, a CPA named Robert Shaw, who'd been doing my returns since I graduated. Robert was in his 50s, methodical and detail-oriented. He reviewed the IRS letter and said it was legitimate but unusual. He asked if I had any reason to believe someone might have reported me for tax evasion. I explained the situation with Veronica, and Robert's expression darkened. He said false reporting to the IRS was a federal crime, but it also created real problems for the person being reported. We'd need to respond thoroughly to the audit, providing all requested documentation, even though my returns were accurate. Robert and I spent hours gathering pay stubs, bank statements, receipts for deductions, every piece of paper that proved my tax returns were correct. The audit process was invasive and stressful, requiring me to justify every dollar I'd earned and spent. While dealing with the IRS audit, my work performance started to suffer. My manager, Nina Alvarez, called me into her office on a Friday afternoon. Nina was tough but fair, a senior engineer who'd mentored me since I started at the company. She asked if everything was okay because I seemed distracted and my code quality had slipped. I debated how much to tell her before deciding honesty was better than evasion. I explained that I was dealing with a difficult family situation involving harassment and false reports to government agencies. Nina listened and then asked if it was affecting my ability to do my job. I admitted it was affecting my focus and I was working on resolving it. Nina said she appreciated my honesty and suggested I take advantage of the company's employee assistance program, which offered free counseling and legal consultations. She also said I should let her know if I needed any accommodations or time off to handle the situation. I thanked her and left her office feeling grateful to work for a company that actually cared about employee well-being. I contacted the employee assistance program and they connected me with additional resources, including a financial advisor who helped me review my accounts and security settings to make sure Veronica couldn't access my information. The financial advisor was Helen Torres, a certified financial planner with 20 years of experience. She reviewed all my accounts and immediately identified security vulnerabilities. My banking apps used security questions that could potentially be answered by someone who knew basic information about me. Helen helped me switch to more secure authentication methods and add additional alerts for unusual activity. She also suggested I pull my credit reports to make sure Veronica hadn't tried to open accounts in my name. I followed her advice and discovered something alarming. There was a credit card application from 2 months ago that I hadn't submitted. The application had been denied due to insufficient income verification, but the attempt was documented on my credit report. I filed a fraud report with the credit bureau and the police. The detective who took my report was Officer David Finch, a financial crimes investigator with 15 years of experience. He reviewed the documentation I'd brought, the protection order, Anne's letters, evidence of Veronica's harassment, and now the fraudulent credit application. Officer Finch said identity theft cases were often difficult to prosecute, but the pattern of behavior I was documenting suggested deliberate and targeted harassment. He opened an investigation and said he'd be in touch as he gathered more evidence. The stress of fighting Veronica on multiple fronts was destroying my peace of mind. I couldn't sleep well, constantly worried about what she'd do next. Dr. Cross helped me develop coping strategies and stress management techniques, but the underlying anxiety remained. Then something shifted. My father called one evening and his voice sounded different, smaller and ashamed. He said he needed to tell me something important. Veronica had approached him asking to borrow money, claiming she was in financial distress because I'd refused to help her. My father had initially agreed to lend her $5,000, but before transferring the money, he'd asked to see her financial statements to understand the full situation. What he found shocked him. Veronica had over $60,000 in credit card debt spread across multiple cards. She'd been making minimum payments for years, while continuing to spend beyond her means. My father had asked what the debt was from, and Veronica had been evasive, mentioning home improvements and necessary expenses. But when my father looked at her bank statements, he saw charges for luxury items, expensive dinners, shopping sprees at high-end stores. Veronica hadn't been living within her means for years, and her debt had nothing to do with helping family members or being generous. She'd been funding an unsustainable lifestyle and was now desperate for money to keep making minimum payments. My father said he'd refused to lend Veronica the money after seeing her spending patterns. Veronica had gotten angry and revealed more than she'd intended, saying she'd calculated that I owed the family over $80,000, and if I'd just paid what I owed, she wouldn't need to borrow from anyone. My father said that's when he finally understood what was really happening, that Veronica had convinced herself my success meant I owed her for past gifts, and she'd built an entire narrative to justify her demands. He apologized for not seeing it sooner, for not supporting me when Veronica first made her demands. He said he'd been conflict-averse as always, but seeing the financial statements had opened his eyes to how manipulative and desperate Veronica had become. I thanked him for calling and for finally acknowledging the truth. It felt like a small victory in a war that had been going very badly. With my father's new understanding of the situation, other family members started questioning Veronica's narrative. My grandmother called asking more pointed questions about why Veronica needed money so badly. My cousin Julian admitted Veronica had been asking him for loans too, claiming the family owed her for years of generosity. The carefully constructed image of Veronica as selfless family matriarch was crumbling as people saw her financial desperation and manipulative tactics. The IRS audit concluded after 2 months of intensive documentation and stress. Robert received a letter stating that my tax returns had been examined and found to be accurate. No changes were necessary. The letter didn't mention who had triggered the audit, but Robert said the timing and circumstances made it clear someone had filed a false report. He suggested I keep the clearance letter as evidence in case Veronica's harassment continued. Officer Finch contacted me with an update on his investigation. He'd traced the fraudulent credit card application to an IP address at the public library, 2 blocks from Veronica's house. Library security footage from that date showed Veronica using a computer terminal during the time the application was submitted. The evidence was circumstantial but compelling when combined with everything else. Officer Finch said he was forwarding his findings to the prosecutor's office with a recommendation for charges of identity theft, filing false reports, and harassment. The prosecutor's office took 3 weeks to review the case before deciding to file charges. Veronica was formally charged with 3 counts of identity theft, 2 counts of filing false reports to government agencies, and 1 count of criminal harassment. The charges carried potential jail time and significant fines. I felt conflicted about Veronica facing criminal charges, but I also knew she'd left me no choice by escalating to illegal tactics. The criminal case moved forward, and Veronica hired an actual defense attorney, a public defender named Rachel Kim, who looked overwhelmed by the amount of evidence against her client. The prosecution had everything: the fraudulent credit application with library footage, the false social services report that Monica had documented, the fake lawyer emails that violated impersonation laws, and the pattern of harassment documented through my protection order filings. Rachel approached Anne about a possible plea deal, suggesting Veronica might be willing to plead guilty to reduce charges in exchange for probation and restitution. Anne consulted with me about whether I'd support a plea deal. I thought about it carefully, talked it through with Dr. Cross and my father. I didn't want Veronica to go to jail, but I needed her to face real consequences that would prevent future harassment. I told Anne I'd support a plea deal if it included supervised probation, mandatory financial counseling, an agreement to pay restitution for my legal fees and the cost of the audit, and a permanent no-contact order. Anne negotiated those terms with Rachel and the prosecutor's office. Veronica agreed to plead guilty to 1 count of identity theft and 1 count of filing a false report. She received 3 years of supervised probation, was ordered to complete financial counseling, had to pay $15,000 in restitution to cover my attorney fees and related costs, and was subject to a permanent no-contact order prohibiting any direct or indirect contact with me. The plea hearing was brief and surreal. Veronica stood before the judge and admitted what she'd done, her voice barely audible. The judge asked if she understood the terms of the plea agreement and the consequences of violating probation. Veronica said yes. The judge accepted the plea and imposed the agreed sentence. Veronica left the courtroom without looking at me, escorted by Rachel, who was probably relieved to close such a difficult case. I felt hollow watching her go, not triumphant or satisfied, just sad that family had come to this. My father attended the hearing and met me outside the courtroom afterward. He hugged me and said he was proud of how I'd handled an impossible situation. We went to lunch together, just the 2 of us, and talked about family and boundaries and how to move forward. He admitted he'd enabled Veronica's behavior for years by avoiding conflict and not questioning her narratives. He said he was going to work on being more present and supportive, actually being the father I'd needed him to be. It felt like a new beginning for our relationship, built on honesty instead of avoidance. 6 months after the plea deal, my life had settled into a new normal. The protection order and probation terms meant Veronica was completely out of my life, no contact at all. Some family members had sided with her and cut me off, including Patricia and her kids, but others, like my father and grandmother, had come to understand what really happened and maintained relationships with me. The family was fractured, but the remaining relationships felt more honest and healthy. I'd been promoted at work, a senior engineer position with more responsibility and better pay. Nina had written a strong recommendation, citing my resilience and professionalism during difficult personal circumstances. I'd continued therapy with Dr. Cross, working through the trauma of being targeted by family and developing stronger boundaries. I'd started dating someone I met through friends, a woman named Kelsey who worked as a teacher and had no connection to my complicated family history. When I eventually told her about Veronica and everything that had happened, she just said she was sorry I'd gone through that and she was impressed by how I'd protected myself. Her matter-of-fact acceptance felt revolutionary compared to the drama I'd experienced. I used the restitution money Veronica paid to fund a scholarship at my community college for students from difficult family situations. The scholarship was anonymous, but knowing it existed made the whole nightmare feel slightly more purposeful. I'd survived being targeted by family and turned the financial recovery into help for others facing similar challenges. I still thought about Veronica sometimes, wondered if the financial counseling had helped her address her spending problems, whether she'd managed to get her debt under control. But mostly, I focused on building the life I wanted, surrounded by people who actually cared about me rather than what they could extract from me. My success was mine, earned through my own effort despite family dysfunction rather than because of family support. And nobody could take that away by presenting me with an invoice and claiming I owed them for gifts they'd given a child who'd had no choice but to accept them. I'd learned that family wasn't defined by blood or obligation, but by mutual respect and genuine care. The people who tried to collect on kindness had never really been kind at all. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.